Let's see if I can move this here. Thank you guys for coming. Appreciate it. My presentation is entitled The Chemical Imbalance Myth, Practical Applications for Calming the Amygdala in Treating Anxiety and PTSD. I wanted to start with a philosophical quote, right, to frame this the right way. So, a little learning is a dangerous thing, but a lot of ignorance is just as bad. The first part of that quote actually came from Alexander Pope. He said, a little learning is a dangerous thing in the context that we often tend to learn things as humans and then feel extremely confident that we know a lot about a subject. But Bob Edwards' response to that was, well, while that may be bad, a lot of ignorance is just as bad, right? So a important philosophical frame here is the concept of balance, okay? A little background, what is the chemical imbalance theory? Well, it was developed in the 1960s. It was actually developed in response to a treatment to tuberculosis. It was not intended, right, to cause the uproar that it did. However, the theory that arose from that treatment was that mental illnesses were caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. To the right, I've shown a diagram there that shows a typical synapse, right? So serotonin is what was localized as the monoamine neurotransmitter that is associated with happiness and peace and calm. Feelings of pleasure, which we know now thanks to 40 years of hindsight research. The way these drugs that arose from this theory started to work was to block the reabsorption of serotonin, which would cause an overload of the serotonin neurotransmitter in the brain, thus increasing the amount of the chemical itself as well as the reaction, so happiness, pleasure, and peace. That's the background on the theory itself. The reason I got interested in this research is I am actually a crisis intervention specialist on the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It's been a topic that is widely debated in the psychiatric world, and I was particularly concerned because my job is to assess individuals to see if they are capable of taking care of themselves, and along that suicidality scale to determine if they are not, to send them to the most immediate psychiatric triage possible. Okay? Unfortunately, in most cases, that's not possible. It's not available, either due to local concerns or financial concerns. They're just not around. So the ER has become the highest level of care for individuals taking their life. Now, anyone in the ER will tell you that's not because they're curing individuals. It's the highest level of care that we currently have because the treatment is a 23-hour hold. So they have people on staff constantly who at least understand some background, have a psychiatrist on call who's able to monitor the patient and see if they need to be prescribed medications. Now, at that point, the medications are seen as a bridge to help an individual calm enough that they can begin psychotherapeutic treatment. Okay? This is a glance straight out of Utah's response plan to the behavioral crisis we're facing. Ideally, again, they would call into the crisis line, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and if needed, we would direct them to some sort of mobile crisis team to be stabilized, if not possible, some type of psychiatric intake center voluntarily. Again, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of those resources available all the time, and so patients end up in the ER. If they are assessed to be a danger to themselves as well as those around them, they are extremely likely to end up in inpatient hospitalization against their will, and a lot of very sad cases in jail. So the problem, I could have chosen 20 of those problems, right, to address here. This is an extremely complicated issue. So at the risk of oversimplifying an already very complex issue, I wanted to do as best of a meta-analysis that I could of current anxiety medications due to the fact that they're prescribed so often, right? They're considered relatively safe, at least the SSRI class. Roughly 20 to 30% of individuals experience benefits. I'll dive into that literature in just a second. Of that group, many still experience symptoms and experience adverse side effects from the medications. So what I was anecdotally experiencing on the Lifeline was that many of the individuals called in already taking an antidepressant. And that concerned me quite a bit, because if the theory is that the antidepressants are helping, those individuals should not be calling into a crisis line, right? So some of the side effects include mood imbalance, numbness, nausea, and an increase in suicidal thoughts, okay? Which, yeah, I heard a laugh there. Yeah, it's somewhat shocking, right? That the symptom they're trying to cure is actually exacerbated in some of these cases. And most have a component of dependency. Okay, so the purpose of this meta-analysis review is to analyze the history and effectiveness of anti-anxiety medications in the context of generalized anxiety disorders, PTSD in individuals in crisis, as well as discuss practical applications that could either be seen as clinical adjuncts to our current treatment, or research implications of where are we going with the neuroscience research to treat these diseases in the future. The questions I started with were: how effective are current anti-anxiety medications? This includes SSRIs and SNRIs, benzodiazepines. What is the history in their rise to popularity? And then what is the future of PTSD and suicide treatment? So I'll start with my first question: how effective are current anti-anxiety medications? So I had to do an extensive literature review. There's no way I had enough time to include every one of my sources that I found on this, but I did find a meta-analysis of anti-anxiety medications that came from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, who are very concerned with the PTSD. As you'll see the graph there, what is most shocking is that the large majority of these medications provided no benefit whatsoever. Unknown, right? So either it helped in some cases and it didn't, the data was not clear, or it helped as much as it was mitigated by some sort of side effect. To the right, I want to draw the no benefit category. This is actually the category where it was not just no benefit, but it was actually deemed as harmful or concerning because of the side effects. Top of that list is benzodiazepines, which I'm going to get to in just a second. However, the conclusions were, after a comprehensive review, the SSRIs and the SNRIs were the only drugs with significant benefit to the patient above a placebo. So in the best case, SSRIs are associated with an overall response rate of approximately 60%. That's at the beginning of treatment in patients with PTSD. However, only 20 to 30% of patients achieve complete remission. Okay. So I wanted to show just how split the psychiatric world is on this due to past research and how complex it is. So this was taken from the University of Washington's medical school website as far as PTSD treatment. Benzodiazepines are the recommended choice to help suicidal patients with heightened levels of anxiety and agitation. Okay, so I just want to remind you, even going back here, to the benzodiazepines were established by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs as extremely harmful. This was in part due to their dependency factor. And they do list this. This is not calling out the University of Washington or these scientists themselves. It's complicated, right? We have conflicting data. And so in this case, they're saying benzodiazepines will help suicidal patients with levels of anxiety and agitation. That is because benzodiazepines, and the most popular you probably know is Xanax. Right? And it's almost a coined term now in our culture, right? If someone's freaking out, you tell them to take a Xanax as a joke, which is a terrible joke, actually. But that's where we are. So the reason it works is because it essentially changes the chemicals inside of the neuron itself. It tells it to completely calm down, right? Benzodiazepines originated from tranquilizers, right, in their history, if you look in that, which is fascinating. But, it seems obvious why they work. Right, because they essentially shut down the nerve responses themselves, which unfortunately has terrible side effects, right? A dependency factor is very high here. So with all of this conflicting data, what led to the rise of popularity of SSRIs and PTSD and anxiety treatments? The answer is actually marketing. Okay, so before I came back to school, I spent 8 years in marketing. I can tell a good marketing scheme when I see one. This was brilliant. Okay, so we also have the hindsight of data and independent investigations that have come out over 50, 60 years of research, as well as class action lawsuits, right, that show a lot of these details that we didn't know even 20 years ago, okay? So independent investigations found that these pharmaceutical companies were actually paying for a lot of these studies, okay? So big shocker, the evidence that was showcased selectively reported so that the medications were seen as far more beneficial than they actually were. As a result, sales skyrocketed. The media contributed considerably to the spread of the theory. Again, this is not blaming anyone. This is an analysis of how we got to this point. This is the best data they had at the time. So this is just an example of their marketing. This is Paxil CR, popular medication. Scientific evidence suggests that depression and certain anxiety disorders may be caused by chemical imbalance in the brain. Now, I want to highlight here, in all of my literature review, I could not find a single test that proved that there was some sort of chemical imbalance that these drugs were actually curing. This is a theory, right? But these companies are, alluding to the fact that while it may be possible there's some other evidence, it also suggests depression and certain anxieties are caused by chemical imbalance in the brain. And as we know, causation is very different from correlation. Lexapro is another popular one. Whatever the circumstances, depression is caused by an imbalance of certain chemicals in the brain. Okay? Again, these are taken from their own marketing material. This was, again, provided by a class action lawsuit. Zoloft, one of the most popularly prescribed medications in the United States today. Scientists believe people with depression could have an imbalance of serotonin in their brain. That means their level of serotonin is off. Okay? These are the peak sales of these major pharmaceutical companies before their drugs went generic. Okay? So a lot of the public does not know that these drugs have been generic for the past 10 years. And what they are currently what they're currently taking is actually a generic version of the drug. As soon as the pharmaceutical companies could not make the money, they actually left. Right? They are not currently conducting any major therapeutic studies for antipsychotic medication. Okay? A lot of the studies being done are more independent, they're smaller, they have adjuncts to other diseases. But that was quite shocking to me. It left me with somewhat of a spooky feeling to find that they had left a long time ago. And as I was contemplating the effects of this, I started digging into more literature. And there was a study at Harvard's McLean Hospital that claims that actually using the language of chemical imbalances wasn't just inaccurate as far as the biological mechanism that couldn't be proved, it actually worsened patient outcomes. For example, a depressed person would enter, they'd be told they had a chemical imbalance in the brain, i.e. their brain was broken, right? It could have been genetic, therefore they can't change it. And thus they will need a crutch the rest of their life to operate as normally as the individuals around them appear to be operating. I mean, it doesn't take much to kind of see how that wouldn't be beneficial in patient outcomes. So that is not a pretty picture. And I did not want to leave you with that because there is some fascinating research going on in the neuroscience world right now. What is the future of anxiety, PTSD, and suicide treatments? I like the way the Stanford professor kind of summed up my research. He said the idea of a chemical imbalance has actually been quite useful. That you have a chemical soup in which there may be too much or too little serotonin or dopamine in the brain, or norepinephrine, which was an SNRI, was trying to treat. But in truth, the brain soup idea is no longer adequate. It really has reached a dead end. That is why antidepressants aren't working for so many people. All the current medications work via these same mechanisms. Therefore, there's a great need to understand in greater detail the brain's actual biology that underlies depression symptoms or anxiety symptoms so that the novel therapies can be found. So what are those novel therapies? I found one that was pretty incredible. This is called the Stellite ganglion block. Instead of coming from the standpoint that there's a chemical imbalance that needed to be treated at the chemical level, the Stellite ganglion block was a procedure that arose out of the veterans on the ground who were experiencing severe symptoms and the medications weren't helping them. And so what it is it's an anesthetic that is actually injected right below your brain. So if you imagine your brain, it has a brain stem that comes down called the cervical trunk. That leads to the rest of your sympathetic nervous system. This theory is actually that the brain is a feedback system. And there's a lot of independent research that proves that this is the way it is. For example, when you experience pain in your finger, right, those neurons are sending a feedback to the brain. The brain in turn responds, right? It's actually a two-way system, right? Which is a much more advanced model than the brain is the central point that needs a chemical rebalance. And so this anesthetic essentially numbs right in between where those two systems feed off each other. So by calming the body, right where the sympathetic nervous system spreads to the rest, the brain is sent a message that the body is calm. And therefore, the brain restarts back to normal levels before it experienced the traumatic event that told it it was in danger. Pretty incredible. The literature was also incredible. In tandem with psychotherapy, the effectiveness rates have been 70 to 80%. Now, that seems overly optimistic, right? Especially with how far we've come in our understanding of drugs. However, the SSRIs and SNRIs that are the beneficial anti-anxiety medication right now are working at 20 to 30%. And as wonderful of a clinical outcome as that is, we should be hoping for something a little better than that. And this is where I think it is. Despite the benefits of these SSRIs and SNRIs, their success varies widely depending on the biological makeup of the person. 20 to 30% is a fair number. Much of the early sales success was due to effective marketing of a chemical imbalance theory that benefited pharmaceuticals more than individuals. Psychiatric pharmacology research has actually dwindled. Treatments targeting the calming of the amygdala and sympathetic nervous system, such as the stellate ganglion block, succeed at treating PTSD and anxiety patients at a rate of 70 to 80%. That is a 50 to 60% better outcome over the SSRIs, with virtually no side effects. In many of these stories, as I dug into this research, there's actually videos of veterans talking about their experience online. I actually met with the doctor who did this treatment to ask him more questions. Their stories are incredible. It's hard not to start crying to see how much pain they were in and to see how beneficial the treatment was. Therefore, the SGB may be a better bridge therapy, going back to our crisis model, as patients enter the hospital, to have an anesthesiologist or a psychiatric nurse in tandem with an anesthesiologist, CRNA, that are able to administer this shot with immediate response effects to calm their body, thus no longer requiring benzodiazepines and their heavy dependency and withdrawal rates. So that's the clinical implication. The research implication is to study why this treatment is working so well, right? To see if the theory of that feedback between the sympathetic nervous system and the brain and the localization, right, of getting the brain to restart itself rather than depending on an outside chemical to enact it. That, I believe, is the future of neuroscience research. So, that's it. These are my sources, and then thank you to the professors who kind of helped me along the way get to here, and I appreciate their help. So, any questions? Yes?
That 70 to 80%.
Yeah.
Is that the immediate effectiveness or is that long-term ownership?
Yeah, so one of the limits to this study is actually we don't have a lot of research, right? So I'm comparing data from SSRIs and medications that we have 60 years to look at. That is the limitation to these studies, and part of the reason I want to go into this in the first place is to actually experiment with this over long-term effects. Those were 8-week responses. And I chose that in part because the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs used a similar model when they were comparing the medications, right? So it is somewhat of a fair, analysis, but we have to take it with a grain of salt that it might be too positive of a result. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, another significant limitation right now is that to do this out of pocket, right, it would cost somewhere between $800 and $1,200 for an individual, right? Now, the benefit of medications is a lot of them are now covered by insurance. So the more that the public awareness grows of this treatment and potential benefits of it and implications in clinical practice, the more those insurance companies are actually going to pay attention to that. The law is going to start paying attention to that, right? The local lawmakers are going to have to recognize that this is far more effective than the treatments we've used in the past. So great question. Yeah, another great limitation that we have to look at. Yeah. That's a fantastic question. I talked about that with the doctor who did some of the studies that I researched. His response is that about 50% of the time he had veterans come back to do a second treatment, and at that point, they were achieving even higher numbers than the 70 to 80%. It was closer to 95% is what he said after they had a second treatment. And part of the reason is, again, a lot of this is experimental. We don't actually understand what's happening in the brain. Not many psychiatrists and neuroscientists are probably willing to admit that, but the truth is we don't. And so it does require additional experimentation to figure out just how much and where. And so part of that could be, part of that need for a second dose could be due to that lack of information. But it also, it's just kind of fascinating to see where it's going from here. So many did, about 50% benefited from one, in summary. Some required two, but at that point, the rates were much higher. They just couldn't include these in these actual studies because that's more anecdotal experience. Fantastic. Sure, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, fantastic question. I don't even know if I can do that question the honor it deserves, right, with an intelligent response. The reality is public education is going to go a long way, right? The same way these marketing schemes were so effective is because it reached directly to the viewers and it explained the topic in a very simple way that resonated with an individual who was experiencing those symptoms. We could do that in a similar way by showing actually how the treatment is beneficial. Right, we'd actually have literature to back this up this time, as well as transparency. That would, moderate for some of the bias that was actually implicit in those studies. But it's a great question. Public education, I think, is the farthest way we're going to go. Personal stories, sharing, even a brilliant marketing scheme that is backed by the literature, I think, is a powerful way to do this. So, great questions. Do you have one more? Sorry, I don't mean to take up too much time. Yeah, for which one? The stellate ganglion block? So side effects include partial paralysis of the face because you have to understand that you're actually blocking the nerves that your brain would communicate to the entire side of your body, whichever the block was administered on. It's temporary. It's about 2 hours that's experienced, and then the patients went back to normal. There were no long-term side effects to that. Apart from that, there were none. They could not find any other adverse side effects to this issue. Now, some of the limiting portions of the study, they actually didn't include suicidal individuals in the study. And that, to me, while that is a limiting factor, I actually find that quite fascinating because suicidal individuals often tend to be those who are activated in the same way PTSD individuals are activated. So, potential for interesting research to see if those numbers would actually go up if suicidal individuals were included in that study. It's a great question. Thank you. I think that's it. Thank you so much.